Hi, this is Misha, and this time we're going to look at the USS Franklin from Star Trek Beyond, 2016 film. Still in the JJverse, but getting away from being directed by JJ. In the film, this was quite famous as a historical ship for being Earth's first Warp 4 vessel. And like the Kelvin over here, it is technically what we call the prime timeline. Or, as I like to think of it, the real timeline. Let's see. And this, of course, is an Eaglemoss model. One of the special editions that they've done. And I think one of my favorites, as many that have seen this model. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't have this in my Evolution History of Warp. Well, really, it's because it is a special. It is a XL. Excuse me, it is a large, not an XL. Sorry, guys. I just was eating a bite of dinner, and it was a little spicy. And it just would have looked weird in that video. Much like I said in my Kelvin video, I appreciate the fact that it's a large model, but also I'm a little, because it doesn't scale at all with my other ships. So there's pros and cons to doing it. We don't know exactly when the USS Franklin was launched, but since it was the first Warp 4 ship, we know it would have been prior to 2151, which is when the NX-01 Enterprise was launched. And since the Enterprise was commissioned way back in 2140, just by extrapolation, this has to be around that time period. Now, it's possible this could have been commissioned earlier itself, 2135, let's say, and wasn't ready to go until 2140 or 2145, but couldn't have been much later than that. As far as class name, we don't know for 100% sure, but if the convention is followed with the other Star Trek, and since this is the USS Franklin and it was the first Warp 4, we can assume it was the first in its class, and therefore Franklin class. I've seen some places, kind of side canon, refer to it as the Freedom class. I don't like this for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't keep with convention. Two, we already have a Freedom class from Next Generation, so why use the same name again? I know, logistically we can, but yeah, I don't see a reason to do when Franklin works perfectly well. It's not a huge ship. It's about 137 meters tip to tip, and as you can tell, a lot of that is the engines. We have only 3 decks. If we look at the saucer, as it were, head on or side on, it looks relatively thick, so we can tell that the saucer is relatively small. And we only have a crew of about 30, which is kind of in keeping with some earlier Starfleet ships like the SS Emmett and the so-called Warp Delta, which were featured in my History of Warp video. Initially, like a lot of people, I thought this came after the Intrepid half saucer, but really, aside from this having more or less a full saucer with just kind of a slice taken out of it, Everything else about it points to it coming before the Intrepid. For one, we don't see it in Enterprise. And we do see the Intrepid a couple of times, 3 at least that I can think of. So if this were a newer ship than Intrepid, you'd think we'd see it, and we don't. 2, the size. The Intrepid seems to be a larger ship with a larger crew. And generally speaking, it follows that would make it a newer ship. We know that this had hull plating, ionized hull plating for defense, and that it had phase cannons for offense, and perhaps it had spatial torpedoes. Most likely it did as well. We know that this was a freighter, or at least was used as a freighter, which would kind of make sense that this was Earth's first Warp 4 craft. It would have maybe been used to transport vital material to Earth's colonies faster, say medical supplies or perishable foods or, I don't know, dioxins. So it seems weird that an experimental craft or the first of one type would be used as a kind of a freighter or transport, not an exploration craft. But if you think about it, it's not at all far-fetched. Also, this would have predated, at least originally, transporters that were authorized for humans, for live matter. But we know it had a transporter, so it was only for cargo. Which very much makes sense. We know that this survived the Romulan Wars, which were from 2155, 2156 till about 2160. So it made it through that. Presumably it was upgraded some. And then it was recommissioned into Federation service in 2161. Prior to that, of course, it had been under Starfleet, but under United Earth Starfleet, and not the Federation. And from that point on, it was used as an exploration craft for a few years, but then it disappeared in the Gagarin radiation belt in 2164. Now, in the Prime timeline, we don't really know if it was ever discovered. We can assume it probably was at some juncture. But, of course, in Star Trek Beyond, it was discovered in 2263 by the Enterprise, Kirk and all his crew. And all that fun stuff. And for some weird reason, it had a motorcycle on board. I don't get it. It would have had shuttle pods on board, because, again, it didn't have a transporter for people. Probably had a number of shuttle pods. But motorcycles, I don't think those are space-worthy. So yeah, that is the USS Franklin class, Warp 4. As far as the Eaglemoss model, it's very nice. In some ways, I wish all of them were this size, and other ways I don't. This size does allow for good detail. Some nice weight, like the saucer's metal. Really the only plastic are the engines and their pylons. So we get a lot of metal on this, true die cast. But on the other hand, I'm kind of glad they don't make them all this size, because where would I put them all? As many as they've done. I kind of do like the large size a little more than the XL, because the XLs, while neat, are kind of huge and end up taking up a lot of shelf space. In some ways, I feel that guns are easier to store than some of these models as they get bigger. But this was definitely one, when it came out, I was eager to get, because one, I didn't know what the Franklin looked like, which is an ongoing theme and kind of always been my excuse for picking these up. But for another, I just like that it is a prime ship. And it really fits nicely with the NX-01, the Constitution class, and even the Kelvin and other kind of early ships we've seen. So yeah, I thought it deserved its own video. And again, sorry for not putting it in the warp history video, but I just thought it would look weird and scale weird with the other standard size ships. I do wish they'd done a standard version of this too. I think it would have made a standard size ship very nicely. Well, that's about all I can ramble. Appreciate you tuning in. If you like, I'd appreciate it if you could hit subscribe if you haven't. Share. And if you have any questions or just want to talk about nerd stuff, feel free to drop me a line in the comments. And if by some chance you haven't, you might check out our main page over at the channel Mishaco. We've been at it a number of years now. Well, this is Misha, and I will catch you next time.